Tuberculosis is back. Okay, well, to be fair, it never went away, and it kills millions of people around the world every year. But since 2020, tuberculosis rates have been on the rise in the United States after decades of falling numbers. And I want to talk about it. In today's AF Mini, we're going to talk tuberculosis, obviously. First, we'll go over the disease itself, and then some of the bigger historic instances of it. And then, once we've gone over the dangers of tuberculosis outbreaks, we'll take a quick look at what's been going on in the US. There's currently a pretty gnarly outbreak in and around the Kansas City area as of late January, early February 2025. And there have sadly been a handful of deaths, there are dozens of active infections, and even more latent infections. So let's just get to it. Tuberculosis, commonly shortened to TB, is a bacterial infection primarily caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis. No, it's not named after that. It's named after the nodules that form in the lungs, first called tubercules by Johann Lucas Schönlein in 1834. Different bacterial infections impact your body in different ways, and TB likes to go for the lungs. It can hit other parts of the body too, like the brain, the kidneys, or spine, but it typically goes for the lungs. And symptoms of TB include weakness, fatigue, a loss of appetite, chills, and fever. But those are the symptoms of most infections, viral or bacterial. Now, those suffering from TB also get a really nasty and persistent cough, accompanied by blood or phlegm and chest pain. But here's where things get a bit tricky. There are two types of TB infections. You've got active TB and inactive or latent TB. And those with latent TB don't normally have symptoms, as the bacteria is just kind of hanging out dormant in your body, so you might not even know that you have it at all. But at any time, that latent TB infection can turn active. And since TB primarily affects the lungs, that's also how it spreads. Through the air from one person to another. Coughing, singing, even talking in close proximity, TB bacteria can be easily transmitted. And in fact, according to the CDC, TB is one of the world's leading infectious disease killers, and they estimate that 13 million people in the United States right now live with inactive or latent TB, which is a little over 3.5% of our total population. I think it's 3.88 right now. Now, tuberculosis has been around for a long time. The earliest known evidence of a TB infection dates back 9,000 years to a Neolithic settlement in the eastern Mediterranean called Atlet Yam, which exists today as a submerged village off the coast of modern-day Israel. And no, it is not Atlantis. But TB has been around ever since. We found it in Egyptian mummies, spanning from the Old Kingdom onwards, ancient India and China. It was written about in classical works like Hippocrates' book of the epidemics, and therefore it also appears in Roman works because, let's be honest, the Romans definitely loved borrowing from their Greek predecessors and counterparts. So clearly there have been a lot of TB outbreaks throughout history, large and small. But when I think of TB outbreaks, my brain goes to the Western world in the industrial era. Why? Well, one, I typically study that area, and two, diseases spread through the air and with close contact, right? And they love a nice, dirty, cramped, squalid environment. And what better than the sooty, poverty-stricken world of industrial Europe and the United States in the 19th century. Here's a quote from one of my favorite books, William H. McNeill's classic Plagues and Peoples. I've got it around here somewhere. Here it is. Plagues and Peoples, one of my all-time favorites. Quote, tuberculosis proved unusually tenacious. Some authorities think the incidence of the disease among European populations reached a peak in the 17th century and declined in the 18th, only to crest a second time among the ill-housed and ill-fed inhabitants of industrial towns in the 19th century. Upper classes were, of course, also liable to infection, and consumption actually became fashionable in literary and aesthetic circles in the early decades of the 19th century. End quote. And it was called consumption because those suffering from it looked like they were wasting away. Consumption in that context meant wasting or shriveling, not eating. And McNeil's not kidding about it being fashionable. Tuberculosis went hand in hand with Romanticism and the Romantic movement. Romanticism was an artistic and literary movement that started in the late 18th century, that's the late 1700s, and it was partly a response to the smogginess and grittiness of the industrial period. It was also a response to the Enlightenment in a way, because Romanticism was all about emotion over reason, the beauty of nature and creativity and individualism over tradition and rules, a fascination with folk culture, with the medieval period, the idea of a hero gallantly coming in to save the day. But it wasn't all romance and a turn to the nostalgic historic eras. It also promoted the weird, the occult, diseases, death, my kind of stuff, right? And Romanticism was essentially just a maelstrom of emotion, both good and bad, glossy and gritty. I'm sure you've heard or have seen romantic works. Everything from Jane Austen, pretty much, the Bronte sisters, Ivanhoe by Walter Scott. Dickens was also heavily influenced by the Romantic movement, especially when you think about his gritty industrial worlds like in Oliver Twist and Great Expectations. You've got Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, right? That was part of the Romantic movement, and TB actually features in Les Mis. Fantine dies from it. You know, Anne Hathaway's character, in the one where Hugh Jackman absolutely nails it as Jean Valjean, and Russell Crowe does his best as Javert. I do love Russell Crowe, though, I gotta be honest. But the paintings. I'll get back to TV. I'll get back to TV in a second, I promise. But I have to enthuse about my top 3 paintings, probably of all time, but definitely of the Romantic movement. We'll start with third place. We've got The Lady of Shalott by John William Waterhouse, and I'm actually pretty sure that we had a print of this in our house growing up, or something like it. I don't know. I'm a little fuzzy on my childhood. Now, the painting is based on Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem of the same name, based on the medieval legend of Elaine of Astolat, a woman from Arthurian legend who dies of heartbreak because of her unrequited love for Sir Lancelot. But just look at this thing. It's beautiful, it's soft, it's medieval, it's full of emotion and love and nostalgia for legends and lore. It's gorgeous. This painting represents the pretty side of Romanticism. In second place, and we're going much, much darker here for the top 2, we've got Francisco Goya's Witch's Sabbath. I mean, look at it. It's incredible. You've got a Satan goat wooing a coven of women in the moonlight. The land around them is barren and haunting. It's just peak witchcraft. It's got that medieval and early modern vibe to it. I love this one. But my all-time favorite work of art, which when you see it should come as no surprise to anyone if you know anything about me, is Francisco Goya's Saturn Devouring His Sun. It's got everything. It's weird. It's violent. It's full of raw and powerful emotion. It connects to Greek and Roman mythology. It's the embodiment of chaos and darkness, very much a reflection of the industrial world that Goya lived in. And there have been so many parodies. I mean, just like so many. And they're amazing. And I love them. Now, there are a lot more paintings from this era that are famous, like the Raft of the Medusa. I did an episode on that shipwreck, actually. It was a pretty good one. It ends in cannibalism. There's that famous French painting, Liberty Leading the People, I think it's called. It's from the French Revolution. Or you've also got Gustav Klimt's The Kiss. But the ones that I like, The Lady of Shalott and the 2 Goya pieces, definitely my favorites by far. But back to my original point, now that I've gone on a quick tangent on Romanticism, perhaps you can see what McNeil meant by tuberculosis, also called consumption, as being in vogue. How very aesthetic to be dying and wasting away from a disease that kicked up with industry and modernization. In fact, it was labeled the Romantic disease by some, even called the White Plague. But while the Romantic era artists may have found beauty in the chaos of dying from TB, or consumption as they called it, let's not forget the reality of it. In the 19th century, the peak industrial period, millions of people died in the Western world thanks to crowded cities and unsanitary living conditions, and millions more outside of it. Or, as Professor Dorothy Crawford of the University of Edinburgh notes in her book, Deadly Companions, How Microbes Shaped Our History, quote, "There is no doubt that tuberculosis, which spreads best in crowded, unhygienic, poorly ventilated surroundings, rose to prominence as towns and cities expanded, reaching a peak in the US and Europe in the early 1800s when almost everybody in large cities like London, Paris, and New York was infected, and it was the most common cause of death. This terrible disease, which was called consumption because of the extreme wasting it causes, killed many famous people in the 19th century, including literary giants such as Emily and Anne Bronte, the poet John Keats, and the playwright Anton Chekhov, and has been romanticized in Verdi's La Traviata and Puccini's La Bohème. Indeed, in the 19th century, the pale, drawn appearance of the consumptive was so attractive that the poet Lord Byron is said to have remarked, 'I should like to die of consumption, because the ladies would all say, look at poor Byron, how interesting he looks dying.'" End quote. Now, luckily, in 1882, German physician Robert Koch discovered the bacteria that causes TB, which then led to prevention and treatments. Robert Koch also discovered the bacteria that caused cholera and anthrax, so he's done a lot to help humanity. Germ theory was also more widely accepted by this point in the 19th century, which was helpful. In the early 20th century, scientists worked on vaccines for TB, and in 1921, the BCG vaccine was first used in humans, and it remains the most widely used TB vaccine today. But not in the United States. There are a few reasons for this, and I'm pulling this information from the CDC, so I'm not speculating. In the modern era, there was a low risk of infection of TB in the United States because we were no longer living in dirty, cramped towns. There was also a variable effectiveness seen with the vaccine. It wasn't 100%. And it also sometimes caused a false positive if they were to do a skin test reaction. But despite this, outside the US, it's still very common, and a lot of people who have access to it get it. So because the TB vaccine is not common in the United States, many of us are susceptible to infection. Which brings me back to the article I read that led me to make this episode about tuberculosis coming back. Because historically, and we can look at this lovely chart for help, cases of TB from the 19th century to the 21st century have dropped, right? Which is great. But this chart shows deaths from 1861 to 2014. Check out this chart, published by the CDC. This shows cases and incidences from 93 to 2023, and as you can see, since 2020, there's been a slight uptick. Now this chart, which is TB-related deaths and mortality rates, is level. So the rise in TB cases doesn't automatically mean a rise in deaths, but the recent surge of TB infections in places like Kansas City is still pretty troubling. UC Berkeley professor Jeffrey Cox is quoted in a recent Nat Geo article saying that, quote, "TB is not going away. It might be low here, but it's all over the world. There's going to be invariable flare-ups from time to time. And in places like the US where TB is not endemic, it can spread like wildfire." End quote. And given that 1.5 million people die from TB every year globally, it's definitely a concern that cases are ticking up in the United States. Hopefully, TB remains a minimal threat, but we need to take diseases seriously. Our history is very much shaped by microbes. Whether we like it or not, whether we believe that or not, they're not to be taken lightly. Now, TB is cured like most other bacterial infections, with a course of antibiotics. But the problem is that treating TB is not as simple as a 1-week regimen of pills. It can only be knocked out with a combination of different antibiotics over a period of months. I've read sometimes upwards of 9 to 10 months, and some strains are even drug resistant. So take care of yourselves, please. We don't need another unprecedented event. We've had enough of those in the 21st century. My name is Kelly Beard, and thank you for listening to this AF-Out mini on tuberculosis. If you've enjoyed this episode, go check out some of my other minis or my longer podcast episodes, which drop every other Sunday. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more bloody, gross, mysterious, or weird stories from history.